We're going to roll into your teen years and to your 20s. And just a forewarning for anybody, because we're in the middle of quarantine, I cannot promise that my family will not invade this interview at some point, because that happens. So, but other than that, we're going to roll into your teen years and we're going to roll into your 20s. And this is where things get even more turbulent than it felt like with your childhood. So I'm just going to let you start, because that's the best. I feel like that's the best place to go.
So I feel like the best place to start with teenage years, pre-teenage years, is that not only do you have the hormone shifting and the chemicals in your body shifting and puberty and everything like that, but energetically, there's a couple big changes that happen, and that dynamically changes your abilities and how you approach your abilities and your outlook on your abilities. And I'm approaching this from an energy standpoint. I'm going to use some terms that are more associated with like psychology, but I'm not approaching it from that point of view. I'm approaching it from an energy medicine point of view and a spiritual point of view. So one of the big things that changes almost immediately is up until a certain age, energetically, whether you're aware of it or not as a parent, anything your child ventures into, energetically you venture into. Anything you venture into, the child ventures into. You're kind of a unit or a pair. And when a child is dreaming or astral traveling, you're right there. And so from a standpoint of energy or beings or spirits, when you're dealing with a child, they may get a hint that there's something very bright and very powerful with you, but more times than not, they're going to see the parent's energy before they see the child's energy. And as a parent, without realizing it, you have a pretty good discernment of what's good, what's bad, what's healthy, what's unhealthy in terms of the spiritual. So as much as you can in the spiritual, you are kind of guiding that child. When they hit preteens or teens, depending on how fast they develop spiritually, they step away from the parents and they start venturing on their own. It's important for their development that they do that, because they need to develop their own discernment as to what's healthy and unhealthy for them, depending on what their purpose is and or, you know, what their journey of growth is. But it can get chaotic very quickly. And now it goes from maybe seeing lower vibrational or things like demonics or, you know, spirits from a distance to almost feeling like they're right on top of you, and you stumble constantly into different things. Also, because you're alone, you're more curious now. And so that world, even though it felt big when they were a child, has just become so much more huge, and they have no level of discernment of, you know, what's good and what's bad. The other major change is the activation of the ego or the subconscious, kind of now going into more conscious thinking. And what I mean by that is, as a child, there are moments when your child is very aware energetically, but they don't really sit there and question, why is the spirit in the corner of my room? Or why all of a sudden did I have a memory of World War II? They don't sit there and have that conscious critical thinking. When you're a teenager, that starts really, really happening. And it's on a much deeper level. And they start to really question, why is this happening to me, but it's not happening to this person over here? Or why did I sense this and the person sitting next to me didn't sense it? And why am I here? Why am I part of this universe? Why do I have to put up with this and others don't have to put up with this? And this whole stream of thinking opens up that really wasn't there as a child. As a child, you go through it and you have a very guttural reaction to it. You may question a few things, but it's kind of like a speed roll of continual movement. And it's more like you're almost like a conduit. It's like that subconscious is just going. But when you hit your teenage years, it's almost like now you start tracking everything and you start questioning everything and you start comparing everything. And you start questioning these bigger thoughts of, why does God exist? Why am I here? And that causes chaos for the physical body and for the mental system. And the other thing that opens up is when you move from children into teen, there is what I call like a spiritual death. And that'll be the first time the child really experiences that. And if they have extreme abilities, they're going to register it as a very real thing. Now, for some children, they'll experience it before it's very unique and particular to their childhood and, again, like what their journey is. But most kids are going to experience it going into teenage years, and they're going to have continual visions of them dying. They'll get really explicit details of them dying, and they may have physical ailments that replicate that. Likewise, if there's any major trauma in those preteen teenage years, they will experience a death again. So in my case, I had multiple traumas that were stacked right up on top of each other. And every time I went through these traumas, a spiritual part of me died. And so on top of me just physically dealing with these traumas, I then had a spiritual trauma almost, or a spiritual death, which later, when I get into my late 20s and early 30s, I had to go back and heal in a totally different way spiritually.
Why, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why the spiritual death? Why does that occur in there? Is it just
So it's like a metamorphosis. It's the spiritual body becoming aware of the physical and the physical becoming aware of the spiritual. It's a communication that never really happened before. And so death is not viewed in the spiritual as it is viewed here. Like here, death feels is in some ways very permanent. In the spiritual, it's not. In the spiritual, it's a transition from, almost like, if you want to view it as steps, like you move from one level or one step to another step, but your whole system energetically literally dies and then is rebirthed. And so when you go from preteen to young adult, or from child to preteen teenage years, it's almost like spiritually a whole system, a whole way of working dies and rebirths into the teenage years.
do you think any of this, and I want to continue on with what you're saying, but this is just observation. Do you think any of this has to do with what, when you see with a lot of teens going into depression and anxiety and suicide rates? Don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of other pieces that play into that. But I was wondering, without them knowing, do you think that also may be playing into it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I'm a big believer of, I think mental and emotional health are very important. I think physical health is really important. But I think if you're going to heal fully, you have to approach the spiritual and the energetic side, especially if your child, you or your teen, has spiritual abilities. They will never fully heal unless you approach it from that point of view, in addition to the physical, emotional, and mental. So yes, absolutely. And the spiritual, in my opinion, influences the physical way more than we realize. Most of us can tune it out and filter it out, but children and teens that have extreme abilities, or even just a baseline of abilities, start to figure out really quickly that the spiritual is constantly affecting the physical.
Okay. All right. Now I want to move into your life and how that looked for you.
Okay, so by the time I hit my preteens, my anxiety from my abilities, but also I think I said, like, I moved and I lost that ability to really be in nature. And I started venturing into public school, and then we ended up having a homeschool. Um, by the time I hit my preteen years, not only were my abilities starting to go through the roof, but then I was struggling even more with my anxiety, and I was diagnosed with depression. And so for 2 years, I was medicated. And in some ways, I feel like that really helped me, but in other ways, it was really detrimental. Physically, it was exactly what I needed. I started going to therapy, and my therapist and the medicine allowed me to physically cope and build a physical ground layer, if you will, or a foundation. Spiritually, though, that was the worst thing that could have happened to me. If I thought I was out of control and couldn't control my abilities before being on medication and neuro medication, I was totally out of control. I would, like basically as I'm starting to venture out and deal with all these different energies, as I spoke of earlier, and no longer under the protection of my parents, I now had medication that was controlling the chemicals in my brain, which gave me less control in the dream states or the astral states. And it was almost like being paralyzed, and I was seeing things and experiencing things that I no longer could keep at bay or control or wake myself up. That was a big thing. My anxiety was so great, they put me on sleeping medicine. One of my coping mechanisms to dealing with these spiritual dreams or astral traveling was I had a really good ability of interacting with beings in dream states and also waking myself up. I could no longer do that. So that was a huge turning point. And like I said, it was physically, it was the best thing for me. There were coping mechanisms I then had in place to deal with things when it got even more intense. But on a spiritual level, it was horrific. You have to do, as a parent, you have to make those decisions based on what your child's going through. So there are children that I deal with where it really is the best thing. And then there are children that I deal with where it's just, it's very similar to me, where it gets way out of control very, very quickly, and they become the victim very quickly. And it kind of builds the workload of what they need to heal and process once they're through that window. It's a very double-edged sword. And then the other major thing that happened was my father passed away. And it wasn't a minor thing. He was sick with ALS, and he died in this house. And they gave us 5 years, and he was gone within a year and a half. So not only am I dealing with all this energetic, spiritual level, but then I'm watching someone physically die very rapidly in front of me, and watched him pass. And so here I am in the normal teenager spiritual development of questioning the universe, questioning God, questioning how I fit in. And meanwhile, right in front of me, watching someone die, and physically watching their spirit getting closer and closer to the spiritual, and no longer inhabiting their body, and watching that energetically and spiritually happen in front of me, as well as going through the process on a physical level.
Oh, true. It was like watching one of those, what are those, like sand timer things? Watching that. What I had a question about, not that I'm trying, it feels like when you medicate, not that we're like zipping back to that, but it feels like you're actually put in like quite a dangerous position, because you can't wake yourself up and you're astral projecting and you are working on other dimension levels and you can't get out. Like
Yeah,
that feels like that compromises you.
it does. So I actually, one of the more scary things that happened to me as a teenager was I actually would, so this is when it started. I would get into these states. It started with medication, and then it kind of died down for a while. But I would get in these states where I thought I was awake and I wasn't. And I had never experienced that before in my life. And I would think I was awake, but then I either couldn't move or I couldn't do anything. And in one of those instances, I actually had someone come through the door. It was a man. And he was dressed in a suit, and he sat down on my bed and he started talking to me. He knew my name, and he told me that I had to listen to him. And I realized, well, there's no way this man would have came through the wall and sat on the bed. And again, I was trying to wake myself up. I couldn't get myself to wake up. It was horrifying because my conscious brain is totally there, totally in it. But I have no control over my body. And he then proceeded to pull out a notebook. And in the notebook, he had listed everything in my life that was going to happen to me from whatever age I was. I think I was 14 at the time, till I was 22. And it was nothing good. It was my father dying, my sister trying to commit suicide, another relative successfully committing suicide, me going through all these medical traumas and not being able to get control of my abilities. And he basically said to me, in a not so nice way, I had two options: to either listen to him and he would help me navigate all this, or I don't listen to him and I would be on my own, and in the end I would end up dead. Do I think that guy was a great guy? No, because anything that bargains with you like that and acts like you have a choice and you really don't is not good. But that was when I was on medication and I had no power to speak, no power to do anything but sit there and listen to him. And I remember vividly, that was before my dad was even diagnosed, seeing that my dad was going to die. And so if you can imagine being 14 years old and seeing all of that, it was horrifying. And then not being able to get out of it either. And then having that information when the rest of your family doesn't have that information. Like, I tried to tell my mom. My mom actually is the one that woke me up. She was shaking. She screamed my name a couple times, which I could hear in the dream. And then she came up and she shook me, and she was the one that was able to get me out of it. And I tried to express it to my mom, but I couldn't. I think I just sounded like a 14-year-old having a breakdown and had a nightmare.
That was my next question was, were you able, during this time, were you able to speak to your parents or your sister, or did you have that outlet? Because I know you were in different times than you are now, and it's not that it's super open now to children with these abilities or going through these experiences. It's still not where, but it was better than the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah. So, in some ways, yes. So there's another thing that happens in your teenage years that I forgot to mention. It doesn't happen to every teen. So I want to preface by saying this is select teens, but your energy, just like your hormones and your chemicals, kind of go all over the place. So a common issue when you have a teen in the house is poltergeist activity, things flying off the wall, things moving, things slamming or breaking. So one of the benefits to that happening is you will experience it with other people, so they know something's happening. And I had quite a few instances of that all the way up until my mid-20s with major poltergeist activity or spiritual activity. Some of it was definitely done by spiritual energies, but a lot of it was me. It was my energy all over the place. And my sister experienced that a couple times with me, and so that was validating. My father in that period of my life, my father was the one that I was dealing with the most. My mom worked nights, and I remember showing him different things. He wasn't necessarily, I think in the end, being an adult in hindsight, he was very concerned about me in terms of how I was going to fit in society, and I was just starting to figure that out. So he was very pushing me towards, getting psych evaluations, making sure I didn't have something mentally wrong. So I didn't necessarily feel safe to share things with him. But there were a few moments where he revealed that he had abilities too. And those are held really precious because he didn't share them that often. And that all happened in my teenage years. As a child, he wouldn't really discuss it at all. But when I hit my teenage years, he started revealing like little things. And he was well aware he was going to die a year or two before he actually died. He had said a few things to me. He knew he was going to pass before my 18th birthday.
How did that feel like validation wise? Or make things, I would assume that it made things a bit easier for you when he came forward and saying, even if there were small moments about his own abilities or things that he'd experienced.
As a teen, it made me very, very angry because I felt like I had gone my whole childhood and my preteens of him basically putting it on me that I was mentally unstable.
Yeah.
So in the moment, I was very angry that he had all this knowledge and he was refusing to share it or say, you're going to get through this or you're going to be able to deal with it. As an adult, now I appreciate those moments. But as a teen, I remember being livid. And I remember one of the times screaming at him, I can't believe this whole time you knew exactly what I was going through and pretended like I was like mentally unstable, like I was crazy. My mom was definitely the more open, and what she did is she tried to talk to me, and she wouldn't devalue what I was saying, but she also wouldn't share stories. And again, she didn't really share her personal stories until I was in my 20s. She would share tiny things, but she was normally the one that if I could, I would go to her, because she was more open to it, and more kind in her responses. She didn't put it back on me like there was something wrong with me.
I always notice that with with the little ones, because um, that I notice how much relief they feel when they ask me questions about, well, this is happening to me. And I'm like, you know what? That happened to me also.
Yeah,
And during this time, and, you know, adults would call it imaginary friends. Let's just say it's something like that, or my imagination, or, and sometimes I don't have the answer, or I do say like that didn't happen for me, but that doesn't mean I can't, you know, be here for you. But you can sense the relief. The relief is huge for
yeah.
them.
Yeah, and in my later years, when my mom really started opening up and sharing her experiences, that's exactly what I felt. It was like, it was this feeling that I was kind of like fighting a war all by myself. And then it
Yeah.
turned out there were other people that were there with me the whole time. And they were struggling just as much as I was. And that's how I view my dad now. As an adult, making my way through this journey, I realized he was struggling just as much as I was, and he had no support other than my mother and did not know what to do with it, and did not know how to cope with it.
I have a question about poltergeists, because what are poltergeists?
So poltergeist, typically how they're described are energy or bursts of energy or beings that can actually move objects. So like, when you have a baseline spirit, they typically, you might sense them, you might see them, sometimes you'll hear them if they're trying to communicate, but they won't typically throw stuff across the room. They won't slam things in your face. So like as a teenager, like I remember me and my sister got in a fight or something, and we had a stack of CDs, and they literally spit one by one across the room, hitting the opposite wall. Poltergeist activity, like another example, is when I was a teenager, I got out of the shower one day and I put my bra on, and I felt someone stick their finger behind the bra and snap it against my back, and there was no one else in the room with me. So like it's a type of energy or being that can actually physically manipulate your 3D world. Most spirits cannot do that.
Why would they want to do that?
That's a good question. And so that's why working with teenagers and preteens, when you start to get their energy under control, what I have found is a lot of times the poltergeist activity goes away. It takes a heck of a lot of energy to be able to move something in the 3D world from a spiritual standpoint. It is not easy. So you are either dealing with a being that desperately needs your attention, or you are more dealing with a reflection of your energy or a part of you that needs healing or needs your attention. Um, what I can tell you is, as an adult, I started doing and working with investigators and paranormal investigators, and that is the truth more times than not. Almost always the poltergeist activity is related to the individual that's experiencing it versus an actual being that's in the house causing it to happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, it's just rare.
Okay, so that's so interesting. So it's actually more often than not, it is your own energy reflecting
Right. And you
back
think
to
about,
you.
like, as a teenager, like, think about how your hormones, like,
Oh yeah.
they explode all over the place, right? And you're like on this emotional roller coaster. Like, one minute you can be screaming and the next minute you're genuinely feeling so happy. One minute you hate your parents and the next minute you absolutely adore them. Your energy's doing the same thing. It's literally spitting out all over the place, trying to figure out how to balance, trying to figure out what's working within the system.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. I always just thought poltergeist activity would solely have to do with another energy, not ever thinking that it would have to do with our own reflecting back to us.
Mm.
Okay. Where else would you like to go in your teenage years? Because I know that it is layered.
Yes, it is very, very layered. So after my dad died, I guess that would be the best place to start. After my dad died, I really started questioning the spiritual. And part of the reason that I started questioning the spiritual is because of the experiences I was having. So up until that point, I questioned the spiritual in terms of comparison to my peers. Like, why am I experiencing this but my next door neighbor isn't? Why did I have nightmares when I slept over at the friend's house to the point that I am a mess and sick, but they were totally fine, or they're totally fine when they come to my house? Why am like, that was kind of my awareness. Well, after my dad died, now I started questioning my role in the universe, and why did I go through this? Why was there a being that came in and told me this was going to happen? And that was really the first thing that was on its long list that happened, that came true from his list. And so I really started questioning all of that. And then on top of that, I'm going through grief. And if you have been through grief and experienced grief, you know that what grief really is basically 10,000 emotions all hitting you at once. And you go through periods of anger and rage and denial. And so then I started getting very angry with the spiritual, and started getting very angry that God would let this happen to me, or that I had to be this different. Luckily, I had those coping mechanisms in place from the therapist. So I went through depression, but it was a different level of depression. So when I was a preteen, the depression all centered around suicide and wanting to run away. After my dad died, the depression was more like just not taking care of myself. I had thoughts of death and feelings of death, but I didn't actually have the physical drive to act on it. And that was because of the coping mechanisms from the therapist. So I could handle it in a totally different way. Almost immediately, literally immediately, in less than 24 hours, my father's spirit was back in the house. And that caused major issues for me. And we were having experiences as a family, so that also caused major issues for me. It wasn't just me. So in less than 24 hours the following day, my dad had a set routine when he went to work. He always came home between 4 and 4:30. You would hear the door open. He'd come in, he'd throw his keys on the piano, the dogs would bark. The following day, even though he hadn't been able to work for almost a year, you heard the door open, he threw his keys on the piano, the dogs went running up thinking he was home, you heard the door shut, you heard him put his jacket in the closet, and he wasn't there. So that was extremely hard for me as well. And to me, rather than being curious about it, it just made me very angry. And to me, it felt like I was never going to be able to get through this grief because he wasn't actually gone. For me, he wasn't actually gone. And then I was seeing my sister and my mom struggle with very similar experiences. Um, what ended up happening, so he died 2 days before my birthday. What ended up happening is I didn't even go to my high school graduation. I never got to look at colleges, the last year where kids get to pick out their colleges and stuff. I never went through that. What ended up happening is I just kind of compartmentalized and decided that no matter what, I was going to be normal. And I had had a couple traumas after my father died, within the family, as well as friends passing. They were like back to back to back. And so within a year, by the end of that year, I had decided I was going to be normal, no matter what it took. So I moved out. I literally pretended like that part of my life had never happened. And anytime I got anything remotely psychic or intuitive, I did everything I could to shut it down. In the end, by the time I was 21, I was very, very sick, and a good portion of that, physically very, very sick, and a good portion of that, I believe, is because I was shutting down my abilities, and that energy has to go somewhere, and things just keep hounding no matter what. If they need to get your attention, they need you to accomplish certain things. So I went through a period of sheer denial of who I was, but also my abilities completely.
What I have to ask about that was only because I'm backing up a little bit. Is I always heard that when a soul passes, that they take like a good period of time, and you could say like this is not the rule. Like it takes a good period of time before they reconnect with family members that have abilities, or I mean, I feel like the people who quote unquote don't have as strong abilities always sense more in that case. They always say, oh, I feel like they're here. I feel like they're there. But that this soul takes time to do whatever they need to do in the passing, and it can take years. What's your thought on that?
So my thought is, if you don't have any abilities or you have a mid-level of abilities, yep, absolutely. But if you have extreme abilities, you're going to watch it second by second. You're going to literally watch them go through every level and then get to the level where they can get to the point where they can communicate to a layperson who has no abilities. And I think looking back, that's what I was experiencing. Also, with the knowledge that I have now, I also know, I didn't know this as a teenager, I am way more attuned to the spiritual than I am in the physical. Physically, I am so ridiculously slow at processing things. I have gotten better, but as a teenager, even though I thought I was living life and I just didn't understand why it didn't feel fulfilling and things were never working out for me, looking back, I know that I was way more spiritual than I was physical, and I was fighting to be physical. And this is a perfect example. And I literally, whether I wanted to or not, was tracking my dad through all these different levels of his learning, of his ability to pass on, of what he needed to come to terms with, the whole transitioning process. But in terms of him walking through the door, there is a thing called imprints. And imprints is in the energy world, and what it is if there's a habit a physical person has over and over and over again, they pass, it's almost like that energy kind of releases for a time, that imprint will open back up. So a lot of times when ghost hunters go to investigate, a lot of times they get imprints. So like they'll hear the music playing their favorite record that they played over and over and over again. Or if someone had gotten traumatic news while they're in the rocking chair and that was their favorite thing to do, they'll see the rocking chair go back and forth. So in terms of my father and the door opening, I think that was an imprint that got released with his death. But as a teenager, I immediately registered it as my dad was coming back to the house, and he wasn't really gone. And how was I going to cope with this and grieve when I'm getting inundated with this all the time? And in my teenage years, especially, my dad and I didn't always get along. So that was the other thing that kept going. I not only would I have experiences like that where I would see my dad, but then I'd have experiences where he was reprimanding me or he was commenting on the choices I was making. And it never stopped. And what I think was happening is that, like I said, I was tracking them through all those layers without realizing it. I think if you didn't have extreme abilities, yes, it would be a little while before you hear from them. But when you have extreme abilities, there is no time or space. There isn't. Everything's just there. Everything's just energy. And if you're aware of that, a person could be alive and I can still talk to their spirit and track their spirit. It doesn't matter if they've passed or not. To me, it doesn't matter. My abilities are on that level. So, I can talk to you physically and also talk to your spirit right now, even though you're very much alive.
When you say that you're very much more in the spiritual than the physical, or struggle in the physical per se, I'm saying, what would the example kind of be of struggling in the physical? Like, not that you had to go to college, but not going through the process of going to college, or I don't know, I'm making this up, but like not going to dances. I don't know. What is
The
that?
biggest, looking back, the biggest issue that I had being more in the spiritual than the physical was my relationships. So I would read someone on a spiritual level. So I'd know if they were lying. I'd know if they didn't know the whole truth. I'd know if they were experiencing 45 emotions while they said something. And I'd hold them to it thinking it was very physical. And it took me till my mid 20s to 30s. It finally dawned on me, what I'm reading is not physical. I'm reading this whole spiritual, energetic side of a person. Physically, they don't know. Physically, sometimes people don't know they're lying. They don't know how they feel. They don't know what they think. They don't know themselves. So where I see it hindering me the most is in my relationships, both professionally and personally, because I'm reading a totally different reality than what's here in the 3D. And I'm holding people to it. I'm also hesitating on what opportunities I take because I'm seeing the whole possibility of what can happen in the future or where it was in the past, rather than going out there and doing different things just to experience it and live. And that's where I see it in hindsight of how it was hindering me. As a teenager and an adult, though, I was beside myself. I just couldn't figure out what was happening. And what I felt like was almost like I was living in an alternate dimension. And on top of that, the spiritual never stopped. So I was constantly having spirits trying to come through people. I was having the poltergeist activity. I was having wild experiences, and it became abundantly clear it didn't matter where I was. Like, I kept trying to blame it on the houses I was living in or the people I was living with. And very quickly, by the time I was 20, I had put together, it has nothing to do with anyone, it's me. And whatever this is following me. And it's destroying my life, and I can't be normal like I'm trying to be.
Did that make it so like it felt like you couldn't get close to too many people?
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm sure it even filters into this, because
It
if it's,
was inevitable to
yeah,
me that eventually everything would crumble and fall. It continually happened from the time I was a teenager till I was in my 23 or 24. That was my thinking. It's just like I was almost like I was always holding my breath, waiting for it to fall, because it was inevitably it would fall. And it was never anything graceful. It was always extremely traumatic. Like, I couldn't just have a breakup. It had to be a breakup on an extreme level. And then the other thing that was happening to me is that because I was blocking out the spiritual, and this will not be the experience for every teenager, so let me just say that. This is more for those that have extreme abilities. But because I was blocking out the the spiritual was doing everything in its power to get my attention. And part of that was sometimes coming through strangers, coming through people. I was having near-death experiences that I really probably should have never even had, but it was in an effort to try to get my attention. And physically, the trauma racked up very quickly. When an energy comes through someone, the hardest part of that is that the person is not aware, nor do they have any memory. So for me, what it was like is someone would read me out or say things to me with information that there's no way they should have known, or do something that was totally uncharacteristic, almost like they're possessed, and then literally just go back to normal. And when I'd call them out on it, they'd have no memory of it whatsoever. So imagine now, if you're questioning your mental state, what that does to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go
What
ahead.
now I'm so wrapped up in all of that that now I'm like, but I forgot like my question that I was holding there for a second. Shoot, it was a good one too. Near death experiences. Back up. All right. Could you tell me a little bit about near death experiences and the spiritual trying to contact you in that way?
So what I have found is that most people don't experience this, and if they do, they experience it like once in their lifetime. There are only a select few kids and teens that I have met where the spiritual it's obviously part of their purpose, right? Or that's what I'm going to say to make us all feel better. It's imperative that they open up and accept that part of themselves to do what they need to do. So literally, they're doing whatever they can to grab your attention, to get your attention. So I had experiences I was almost hit by a car 2 or 3 times. I had an instance where I was with a girlfriend when I was a teenager, and we were driving into the city, and something came over her, and there was a semi stopped in front of us, and she never hit the brakes, and I pulled the emergency brake. And then eventually it was like she woke up and she was able to like swerve the car. And when I questioned her about it, her response to me was that she had just accepted that she was going to die and just chose to go for it. And it was like she was totally unaware that I was in the car with her. And I know it probably doesn't sound that significant, but when you have moments like that over and over and over again, like I think 1 week I was babysitting for a girlfriend, and in 1 week I was almost hit by a car twice, and it wasn't like walking, and it wasn't I don't know how to explain it. There was an energy zing to it. It was thankfully I was aware it was coming intuitively, so I was able to sidestep, although the second time a girlfriend actually pulled me out of the way of the car. Both times the car totally lost control. It wasn't like they weren't paying attention, like they started swerving towards me. So in my case, in my scenario, when I look back on that, I think it was the spiritual trying to get me to accept that. Now, in most cases, when people have near-death experiences, for them, it only happens once or twice, usually once, and it's their conscious brain dipping into that spiritual awareness, and they're a lot of times able to take that with them. So suddenly they become aware of that in-between world or that spiritual world, and they're able to take that into the physical, into the 3D. They're able to stay in touch with it. They're able to communicate with it and do something with it, whether it's communicate with loved ones or this, that, or the other, or, you know, angels or what have you. In my case, it was a little bit different. And I don't have a lot of teens that are on that level. I have a few that have had experiences like that. And it's kind of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? So was it just me being uber aware, and maybe teens have that all the time and they just don't realize it? Or was something genuinely getting my attention and trying to wake me up? In hindsight, I feel like They were trying to get me to accept this part of me, and I was just denying it. I was refusing it.
So what happens now when you keep you want to be normal, right? And you're doing everything in your power to be normal and there's nowhere for it to go. And I think that's a huge part of the point that you're trying one of the points that you're trying to emphasize and shine light on here is that children with these extreme abilities, teens with the extreme abilities, it's pretty normal for them wanting to shut it down. But the
Yep.
danger in that, um, or the possible
So,
dangers in it, or the normalcy of it, you know, all of those.
so I think right off the bat, the very first thing I have to say is there's a physical response to it. And that goes back to me saying earlier, the spiritual is around you all the time. What makes children with abilities different isn't the fact that there's a spirit in the room. What makes them different is the fact that they can see it. The spiritual world never stops moving. It's very much alive. It's very much around you all the time, 24/7. And it is very much affecting every single person, every single animal, every single form of life on this earth at every moment. What makes a child with abilities different is the fact that they can see it, they can feel it, and they can interact with it. And so when you start to shut that down and it's part of who you authentically naturally are, it's not like I came into this world and was like, yeah, this is what I want to do and I developed the skills. That's just what I came in as. And most children with abilities, they aren't looking for it. It just happens. It's part of who they are. Your body has a physical response to it. It's kind of like you trying to saw off a limb, and your body starts to respond to that in numerous ways. So I started getting sick. I was going to the doctors regularly. I absolutely refused it had anything to do with my spiritual abilities. So I started going to the doctors trying to figure out what was going on. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a physical attribute to what was happening, but what I am saying is by me shutting down my abilities, it made the physical so much more exaggerated and exacerbated than it needed to be. So I started going to the doctors. I would have really bizarre symptoms. I had bizarre symptoms throughout my whole childhood and teenage years, like migraines that would come and go, swelling that would come and go. But for some reason, when I got to college, which is why I think it's connected to me shutting down my abilities, they became much more extreme. I would get blisters on my body, like just things that couldn't be explained. So I was getting a lot of tests done while trying to go to college, while trying to work, and not having much of a support system in place at my own doing. Um, the other thing that I did and I'm not ashamed to say this, in some ways it felt good that I did it, is I walked myself over to the psych ward at the local hospital. I literally checked myself in. I told them that I was experiencing all this spiritual activity, and I pretty much begged and prayed that they would find something wrong with me. They psych evaled me and released me within the next day, so within 24 hours, just telling me that I needed therapy and I was just stressed out and there was really nothing going on. So I went through all of that, and I was really hoping that I was at the point where to me it would be more normal if someone diagnosed me with something neurological versus accepting that I had these abilities. I had a few friends in college that I could talk to, but I couldn't talk to them in terms of the gravity or the extreme. And I also couldn't talk to them in terms of how it was affecting me physically. I started becoming aware in my late teens, 20s, that if I had a bad night spiritually, I would inevitably have these weird symptoms that were always different the following day. But I couldn't explain it. And I couldn't go in and tell the doctors that. And I couldn't really tell my friends that because I don't know, I just couldn't do it. And even though I wanted to be diagnosed as crazy, I also didn't want to lose what little reputation I had with my friends of being normal, So I would never tell them the extremes of it. I'd try to tell them like the dreams and stuff like that, but I could never tell them the physical experience of it. Um, so it kind of went downhill physically very quickly. And eventually, what happened is around my 21st birthday, I woke up with paralysis. I had a little bit of a warning. 2 days prior, I tried to pick up quarters with my left hand and couldn't grip them. I called my doctor immediately. I had enough sense, even though my mom and I weren't that close at that moment, to drive myself to my mother's house. And within 48 hours, I was completely paralyzed on my left side, and I could not see or hear. Couldn't see out my peripheral, could not hear on my right side. So it was like I had a stroke. And I was in the hospital for a while. They did a lot of tests, and again, couldn't really find anything. They were convinced that I had ALS like my father. Didn't find anything. They psych eval'd me multiple times, and determined that I had no mental instability whatsoever. But I do remember vividly sitting in the hospital, almost having an out-of-body experience with myself, staring at the wall. And it was like I was having a conversation with myself, and I said to myself in the bed, you got to make a decision. Either you're going to face who you are, or you need to gracefully let go and die. And I remember kind of just being dazed for a while, and then having this moment where I was like, I can face who I am. I can do it. And that kind of became my mantra for a couple years for a while. I didn't immediately get out of the hospital and accept that I had abilities. That's not what happened. There was a whole process of me having to relearn how to move and coming to terms with what I even experienced. And again, I went through a level of just wanting to be normal, but now it was on a physical level. I wanted my paralysis to go away. I wanted the pain to go away. So it was a denial on a totally different scale. And I wanted to go back to the life that I had, which I was studying dance in the hopes of being an expressive therapist. So obviously paralysis and dance do not mix well. So then I was going through a level of denial where I just wanted to get back to that point. What I kind of did, though, that I was cognizant of, is I kind of kept my head down. So what I mean by that is I didn't deny the spiritual. What I ended up doing for quite a few years is just watching it. So I accepted to a certain degree that it was part of my life. And what I started doing was tracking every time that I had an experience of what physical ailment I had. So I have journals upon journals, what type of dreams I had, what type of experiences I was having with people. Like if I felt like something came through them and said something, or they had a piece of knowledge that they really shouldn't have known. But I didn't interact with it. And I didn't try to do anything in terms of my abilities. So for quite a few years, that's all I did, is I just kind of kept my head down, worked on my physical health, but also worked on a physical level, and just watched. And then I made a decision a few years later, which I think we'll go into in the next interview, that I was going to be proactive with it and actually do something with it. But that's kind of what it looked like. And that's me trying to paraphrase everything into a real tiny shell, like a nutshell, like that. It's really a very hard thing to describe or express. And like you said, there's so many layers to it. And this is a topic, the teenage and young years, or young adult years, where we could easily spend 5 or 6 hours just discussing, because you're getting hit on every level. You're opening up emotionally, you're opening up mentally, you're opening up physically. And then on top of that, you're opening up spiritually. And all three of those layers, your emotional, your mental, and your physical, affect the spiritual and how you view it and interact with it, in addition to just it hitting you.
Is this another time where you would consider is a death, as a spiritual death is during this
You're talking about the
paralysis time?
paralysis.
Yeah. I was just where you got physically, I mean, we're going through it in in this quarantine, as in And I got put into it when I got kind of cut off from the world and had to sit, be here in the house, trying to help Dominic. But this is your, the spiritual stopping everything for you because
Yep.
you
That's
didn't,
exactly good
like,
word.
yeah,
Yep.
everything must stop.
Right.
And um, I mean, I guess to be in your case, it's even, more extreme because it's like you truly don't get physical, you don't get your physicality back, and you wanted to be more physical,
Right. Right.
And mine, I felt like I was just moving at such a clip and wanting to be so physical and running away from my family. What I was going to lose was I was going to lose my kid, you know, and that was a choice where, sure, you had a choice not to set it off spiritually, but it really sounded like you didn't give a shit. You were going to shut it off.
Right. That's exactly how I was. And I mean, there was a couple of times where I had friends that would experience it and they'd be like, oh my God. And I'd be like, ignore it. Like it didn't happen. I don't care what you say, and sometimes I'd have friends that would have a dream about me or have a vision and I'd be like, nope, not having it. Like I would not engage it to the best of my ability in any way. And I was trying so hard to be physical. But the paralysis at 21, I do believe that I was supposed to die because that was what was listed in the notebook. And that was the final thing that was listed in that notebook. So it was all these traumas between my dad dying all the way up to 21. And I think, I really do think that on a physical level, that may have been a moment where I could have opted out. And something, it was bigger than me because I felt like when I was in that altered state, what I was weighing was not only my physical oomph to be able to push through it and figure it out, but I was also weighing something much bigger than me. Like, was it time for me to do what I needed to do? Or was it even time for me to push through what I was experiencing? I really feel like my body would have given up if if I had chosen the other way. That's what it physically felt like to me.
Well, I mean, like you said, then you did spiritually die.
Right.
There was a spiritual death. Also, too, it wasn't wrong because you had the option. So, like, in that case.
Right.
And I mean, you've said before in the other interview, I mean, there's, a million, 10,000 different strands of the way in which your life can go.
Yep.
You know, that was just I guess, what your spirit had already chosen.
Right.
Um, what, so now that you go through, and I'm pretty much coming down here for time before we move on to the next thing. I had a few little questions that I wanted to ask, just
Sure.
like to tie up. Why does in the children, you are tied to the parent? Why is there, I could be using this in the wrong term, but like a protective space that the spirit world keeps from the children? I'm assuming that when they turn into a preteen teen, that when that gets lifted, that connection, that protection from the parent, that the spirit world kind of jumps on top of the teen. And I could have that description terribly wrong.
Well, so no, I think it's two sides of the same coin. So I think the way you're describing it is how every preteen and teen is going to experience it.
Okay.
It totally feels like it all of a sudden the floodgates open and it's right on top of you and you're drowning. Um, the reality is, though, the other side of that coin is it's part of your growth, it's part of your journey. Everyone goes through it, they're just not aware of it. It's kind of like you're coming of age. You're the one that opened the floodgates. You just weren't, you didn't know it. And there's a piece of you that is trying to get certain lessons and certain growth to your physical body and certain understandings to your physical body. And so, I think on one hand, it's exactly like you said, you're drowning in it and the floodgates open and it's right on top of you. The other hand of that is your spiritual self has a hand in that. It's encouraging that. It's part of the journey. And for every teen and preteen, it's going to look totally different. In my case, I got everything. I got demonics, I got lower vibration, I got a whole plethora of energies and beings. It won't be that way for every child and every teen and adult. It's part of the cycle of life. Everyone's got to move from a child to a teen. Everyone's got to move from a teen into a young adult. Everyone's got to move from a young adult to what you would consider like the mother or father, and everyone's got to move from the mother or father into the grandmother age or grandfather age. Doesn't mean they have to have children, but those, like even in mythology, those are the cycles. The triple goddess, or the gods, like those are the different cycles all life goes through. And so I think it's just part of the journey. And in my opinion, now being in this for a while and working with children and teens, the only change that's actually happening is that your conscious brain is registering something that was always around it. And for some people, the conscious brain, it's really not a big thing. But then for other people, it's very traumatic and it's very jarring. I think what's happening is it's moving into the conscious brain, and it's kind of like when you're a child, you played make believe and you didn't really actually question, is this person real or not? You hit your teenage years and you realize it feels like there's something interacting with me. It feels like there's something having a conversation. Why am I having these sensations? So I think really at the end of the day, it's your physical becoming aware of something that was always around it. And for each individual, it's dependent on how jarring it's going to be to their system.
What, like, and this is out of sheer interest, if you have a smaller child, right, one that is under the protective bubble of their parent, but they have a parent who, it is not wonderful. I know that that comes with the journey that you chose and whatnot. Does that leave them more open to not being protected? I don't know if this is like a confusing question. You catch where I'm going with this?
So no, this is a question this has been asked, right? So even for adoptive parents, how can they be that protection if that's not actually their birth child?
Yeah.
But it actually doesn't make a difference spiritually. So, and the other really heartbreaking reality is for some of these teens and adults that have extreme abilities is that who someone is spiritually can be completely different than who they are physically.
Yeah.
So you can have a parent that is physically violent, not supportive, but in the spiritual, they're a big ball of light and they're extremely protective. So it's extremely hard for the brain to understand. The spiritual is a totally different ball game. It looks totally different. And the spiritual interacts with the physical and the physical interacts with the spiritual. So in a scenario like that, just because someone is violent or not what we would consider physically protective doesn't mean they aren't capable of it. It just means they're blocking it or stopping it for some reason. And with that said, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in the spiritual. So they can be, like I said, very dark here, but in the spiritual, they're a big ball of light. I have also met children that have parents that are extremely protective here, but they aren't so much in the spiritual. They're actually very careless in the spiritual. And again, that has to do with the child's journey and the growth that they chose. So that isn't necessarily related, but it exists. And in the cases where the parents are being careless or say they don't have protection, usually another energy being steps in. So you will pick up some form of protection around that child in some way. if it can't come from a physical parent. But that actually doesn't happen that often.
Interesting. And then, with this, with you growing up through your teens and going through all this, you have had, in this case, you've had no mentor whatsoever, no help. You're nothing.
I've looked. When I got to my mid-20s and I went through that period of where I had my head down and I was just watching, in my mind, I had gathered enough evidence and vocabulary from writing in my journals what I was experiencing that I could start to describe it. And so I started looking. I really started studying mythology and getting books on metaphysics, and I started doing different community things here or there, trying desperately to find someone. And I would find pieces. It isn't that I didn't find anything. I don't want to give that impression. But I didn't find anyone that was experiencing it to the scale that I was experiencing it. And actually, multiple times I went to Intuits and got readings. And one of the first things they always said to me is, "You're not going to find a teacher. You can keep looking, but you're wasting your time. You're not going to find a teacher." The way that I perceive is just, it's on a different scale. And like I said, I read a lot of things and they have pieces, but it's never to the degree that me and some of these teens and children are experiencing on that extreme level, where it's literally every moment of every day is a spiritual experience. And you're fighting to try to be physical. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because if there's anyone that can help someone become spiritual, it's going to be those that actually live in the spiritual world and have figured out how to be physical. They're the best avenue to help you understand how to discern what's out there, because so many times people blend all these different energies all together. And they blend it with their perception as well. If something doesn't feel good or something does feel good, they automatically decide what this being is or this energy is, and it doesn't quite work that way. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, no. Do you think too, and I mean, we don't have to get too deep into it, but this, when you started to trying to become normal, quote unquote, is that when you started also to pulling more away from your mother, or,
Yep.
is
I pulled totally away from my family. When I wanted to become normal, it was on a scale where it's like I didn't want to accept the trauma I had been through. My mom had abilities. She was the only one that was talking to me about it, so I didn't want to have anything to do with that. So it was on all levels that I wanted to be normal. And in my mind, normal was no trauma, either spiritual or physical. And that was like, my mom was kind of my hero my entire life. And that got destroyed for me watching her grieve over my dad. And I'm not saying that's realistic as an adult. I now know otherwise, but you can imagine as a teen, you have this strong woman who always, is patient and very loving. And then all of a sudden she goes through my dad's death and she's, struggling to take care of us. And so mentally, even my perception of her had drastically changed. And I was, like I said, very angry about that on a physical level.
at this point too, I know, I'm gonna end it here, I swear to God. But had your mom, I know your mom started to like venture into doing more stuff and finding more resources for herself. I believe she was doing Reiki and healing.
So
Had she started that by then?
When I moved out, this is how she phrases it, she was like petrified of moving out. And then she had one night where she prayed and didn't know what to do, because she just felt like whatever was getting ready to happen was going to be a really big deal for me. And she was really scared for my life, and scared, like, she, like a mother would be, like, scared I'm going to get in drugs, alcohol, die. And And she knew the spiritual side as well. And I think she put together that I was trying to deny all of that. And something in her told her that was not going to end well. So she prayed and she meditated. And what she heard was just let her go. She'll come back. I really didn't have any contact with her until I was paralyzed. And that was because like I said to you, something told me to go to her. And I swallowed all my pride and all my anger and I went to her. And I guess that's the little kid that's always in you. You know, you go to mom when you're at your, and I obviously knew something was going to happen. And it was after that, because they had done so many tests, like you have to understand, I had had months of tests trying to figure out what these other symptoms were. Then I end up paralyzed. They're doing all these tests. They're getting more and more frustrated. They can't figure out what's going on. I obviously had to move back with her because I couldn't walk. I had lost everything, my education, my career, you know, everything. It was after that that she started looking into Reiki, healing touch, aromatherapy. And some of it was her own interest because she is a nurse and she started studying holistic nursing. But the other half of that, she always told me, was trying to find other avenues for me to heal and understand what was going on. And I ended up taking a couple classes with her. And actually the first class we took was at a local hospital, and it was about a nurse dealing with the spiritual with clients, demonic specifically, with
What?
patients and clients. Yeah, it was
At
crazy.
at the hospital?
At the local hospital, I felt so bad because accidentally they closed the window and there were all these IT people talking about how this woman was crazy. And she no doubt saw that. They like the screen screwed up. But for me, I don't know, it's like it opened something up and I was like, okay, so my mom believes in this and now there's a doctor who is trying to come to terms with this with patients and clients and figuring out a way to deal with it. And her point of view, which just totally floored me and has stuck with me to this day, is it doesn't matter if you believe in it or not. If your patient believes in it, you deal with it. You put your beliefs aside and you help the patient, and it doesn't matter whether you believe in it or not. If you psyche vowed them and you've done all this work and they believe in it, then you do whatever you can to help them. That's your duty as a doctor. It doesn't matter whether the demonics are real or not. And so for me, that opened a huge door. And slowly I started sharing all these experiences that had happened in that time away from my mom. And then she really started looking into things having to do with past life, healing, aromatherapy, and reading as much as she could. And she'd pass different things to me, and then I would do some classes with her. I remember she took me to a community up in Pennsylvania that is specifically for paranormal. And she, you know, was giving me the courage to like speak up and see if there was anyone that had had experiences to the degree that I had. And so it is then my mid-20s where her and I kind of went on this healing journey together, where we not only repaired our relationship, but I was desperately searching for answers. And it was everything from like mythology to different religions to all these different modalities. Like we were doing everything that we could to try to make sense of what my life was and all this information that I was constantly getting inundated with day in and day out. My mom's a hero, by the way.
I know, because I talked to her.
All moms are. Yeah.
Well, because you, as a mother, and I get like choked up even thinking about it, is that like if if your child dies, you die. Like
Yeah.
at the end of the day, like you you
It's you.
that is the number one fear, you know,
Right.
um, that especially if you feel like you could have done something, you know, you it would destroy, it destroys you even to think about it.
Right.
So we're going to leave it there, but that's what we're going to get into with the next episode. But
Right.
Thank you as always. And
Thank you.
we're going to talk very soon.